Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Field, Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. I'm pleased that you can join us for today's discussion of what messaging actually changes minds on climate. Today's conversation is hosted by the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. In today's conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by three experts, Jan Voelkel, Neil Malhotra, and Rainer Romero-Canyas, to discover how insights from psychology and political economy can inform more realistic, evidence-based approaches to engagement, and what comes next as researchers take these strategies into real-world experiments. The starting point for today's conversation is a paper recently published in Nature Climate Change, a registered report megastudy on the persuasiveness of the most cited climate messages, with Jan as the lead author and Neil as a senior author. Everyone interested in progress on climate is aware that action to date has been much too slow, but explanations for the slow pace vary. One hypothesis is that even though a majority of people believe climate change is real and even important, a much smaller number prioritize it as a top or even top 5 issue. Several small studies have asked whether better messaging about climate change can shift attitudes. Now, Jan, Neil, and their colleagues have released a new study with the statistical power to provide robust answers. But before we hear from Jan, Neil, and Rainer, let me say a few words about each. Jan Voelkel is an assistant professor at the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. His research examines the conditions under which people support practices, leaders, and organizations that promise social change. Jan recently moved to Cornell from Stanford, where he completed his MA and PhD. Neil Malhotra is the Edith M. Cornell Professor of Political Economy at Stanford Graduate School of Business. His research covers American politics, political behavior, and survey methodology. His work on voter behavior includes research on the problem of retrospective voting and how strongly voters consider past events when arriving at a vote choice. Neil has also published work on disaster response by governments and how that response is rewarded or punished by voters. Rainer Romero-Canyas is a social and personality psychologist and EDF's lead senior behavioral social scientist. His research is focused on the social and cognitive processes that influence how people think, feel, and behave around environmental issues. Rainer's worked on understanding how people feel about carbon taxes and methane leaks, and on encouraging conservation practices in rural fishermen. He's an advocate for embedding more psychology in policy. Let me start with a question for Jan. Could you just describe for us what you discovered in this new study?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. We find in our study that many of the 10 different treatments that we tested were quite successful in strengthening Americans' pro-environmental attitudes with moving attitudes such as belief in climate change or climate change concern by like 1 to 4 percentage points on the scale from 0 to 100. However, we found that was quite surprising that these messages were similarly persuasive for both Democratic participants as well as Republican participants. But we also found that the messages were not generally successful in moving pro-environmental behavior, which we measured specifically by looking at donations to pro-environmental organizations.
And were the treatments based on reading a piece of text and seeing how that changed the strength of affiliation with the messages?
Exactly. So we had 10 different treatments. Each of them provided text that were trying to manipulate different psychological or social psychological constructs, such as presenting evidence that most scientists agree that there is global warming, or trying to connect climate change mitigation with values such as patriotism or protecting the purity of America's land. And then we compared that to participants in a control condition where they read information about topics that were not related to climate change, such as the history of neckties or the rules of baseball.
And were you surprised at the preponderance of effectiveness or at the size of the effects you saw?
So, um, so like uh, like we came in with like different intuitions. On the one hand, we selected the treatments to be the most cited climate change messages. Like many of them had been developed over the last 10 years and had been quite impactful in their original study. So there was certainly like reason to assume that there would be significant effects of these treatments. But in some of the early pilot testing we had done in like smaller scale studies, we had not found effects. So we were like a bit skeptical. And so in our big study, we found that the effects were there, but relatively small, so that we really needed a lot of people in order to be adequately powered to like detect these small effects reliably.
And Neil, can I ask you a little more about the method that allows you to have confidence in the implications of these treatments? I know this is called a megastudy. Maybe you could say a few words about what that means.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Jan is actually the kind of inventor of the mega study and popularizer, but I'll try to do it justice. So, the idea of a mega study is that normally what researchers do is they have like their pet theory or their pet hypothesis or treatment. And we oftentimes have a slew of papers, which is like one off. The way to move climate change is to tell people X. And then somebody else will come and says, actually, a really great way to do it is to tell people Y. But there's rarely ever like third parties who don't have a horse in the fight to basically say, let's test all of these things together. And that allows you a lot of good things. So one, it allows you to have a common control group. And that's methodologically really important because that's very efficient. If all the treatments can share one control group, and then you can more precisely estimate the effects. A second reason it's important is you can basically have the same sample and taking place at the same time. So, some people, they use undergraduates to do their studies. Some people use workers on Mechanical Turk. Some people use high quality probability samples. Some people did their studies in 2012, some people did them in 2018. So if you see differences across all these studies, you don't know what to attribute them to. But since we did them all at the same time, we know to attribute them to the difference in the messaging. And then one last thing I'll say is one other thing we did is we got the paper accepted before collecting the data. Now, why is that really important? It's important because oftentimes what happens is that researchers see their data and they're tempted to analyze the data in a way that forwards a certain hypothesis. Well, we were basically pre-registering the analyses and the code to analyze the data before seeing any of it. And we committed to what results we were going to show. And we believe that increases the trustworthiness of the findings.
Is that approach of having the study basically accepted before you do the experiment getting to be more common?
Yeah, so this is something that I would say kind of emerged in the last 10 years because of concerns of replicability of findings. And I would say that not every journal or does this, but I would say the leading scientific journals are increasingly viewing this as a way to have credible research that the world can trust.
Fascinating. Reiner, I wonder if you want to comment on how much a study like this changes the way you think about climate messaging in EDF.
Hi. Thanks for the question, Chris. I think it's a great study. It's always really good to be able to see such rigorous, good science testing all these different messages. And as Neil said, often we read really high quality research that's testing one particular model or theory, or in this case, a particular kind of message or communication framework. And that's really not quite like the reality that my colleagues who are doing the communication professionally at EDF or other such groups face. They often have to compare different methods and try different messages without the rigor that Neil and Jan were able to bring, and all their collaborators were able to bring to this. So it's always good to see someone be able to do this. I'm not sure that I can tell you how that would change the communication strategies. In some sense, it probably would. I think uh, oftentimes what organizations, big and small, working on environmental advocacy are doing is no longer trying to convince people that climate change is real or that they should be concerned, but rather to get them on board with some specific action. And so these messages help kind of bridge that first communication effort, knowing which kind of messages and frameworks are successful at that. But then comes a second phase of really trying to get people on board with specific solutions or to pay attention to specific climate impacts.
And as a psychologist, could you comment on why, for example, the science consensus message had the most traction and for some of the people, but in other cases there actually was a no effect of any of the messages?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to tell you about why they succeeded, but there's been quite a bit of research on that. That's sort of our gold standard is to tell people about the scientific consensus. It's very, very helpful. Some of these other effects that prove to be really effective are also not weren't surprising, and it was very nice to see them replicated, particularly some of the older ones like purity and the system compatibility frameworks. The purity, as Neil mentioned, refers to this idea that we want to preserve the purity of nature and conservation efforts are important, and the climate change activism is part of that, or climate action rather. And systems compatibility or preservation is sort of trying to appease the mind of people who might see climate action as some sort of effort to overturn social orders that exist. I think I was particularly surprised when I read the report to look at the ones that didn't have an effect, and I don't really know why they didn't. So I'd like to maybe hear from Jan and Neil what their thoughts are on that. But I think those seem to be powerful because they do seem to um, reach some basic motivations that people have about their social orders and also the trusted source. So telling people that there's this consensus around climate, sort of that climate change is happening has a powerful effect because it really signals that people that are seen as trusted and scientists, despite everything, are still seen as trusted messengers. And so it's important for people to see that they agree that this is a real issue.
Yeah, Jan, let me follow up on Reiner's invitation to have you comment further. Um, what can you say about um, the messages that seem to have the most traction? And is the take-home theme that the messages are strongly differentiated, or that most messages have some role in increasing affinity toward the outcomes?
Yeah, so I would say that it depends a little bit on the specific outcome that we're looking at. So we found that for belief in climate change, we actually had like one of the two scientific consensus messages being clearly or statistically significantly the best performing um, message out of the 10 different ones that we tested. For the other outcomes, there was no clear winner in the sense that while we had one that had descriptively the strongest effect size, we cannot say with high confidence that it is like different from the like second or third best for that outcome. And so like if one is interested in moving belief in climate change, I would say basing one's message on like this specific scientific consensus message might be a great starting point. But for the other ones, the takeaway is probably more there are like 3 or 4 different treatments that all seem promising, but that do not have clearly distinguishable effects.
And Neil, I wonder if you could comment on the result that the effectiveness of the messages for Democrats and Republicans was about the same in terms of changing opinion. Was that what you expected? And was it a surprise that the same messages worked for Democrats and Republicans to about the same level?
Yeah, that's definitely not what I expected. And I guess this study for me raised way more questions than it answered. Maybe Jan would disagree because he's smarter than me, but I have more questions after doing the study. So, I mean, traditionally we think that Democrats are already very pro climate, that they kind of support policies. They've gotten partisan cues from their elected officials for decades that climate is an important issue. And so most of the research over the last 10, 15 years has been how do you convince conservatives and Republicans that climate change policies are in their interest. And the work of Jonathan Haidt was very influential in this, which basically said, if you want to focus on Republicans and conservatives, don't tell the story that you would tell to liberals. Tell the stories that they care about. So stories about purity, about patriotism, about system justification. We did not find evidence for that. So Rainer is right. Like we found that the purity treatment had an effect, but the effect was the same for Democrats and Republicans, which is not what the moral reframing theory would say. And I think one thing is that the previous studies, they tend to have like enough sample to basically say, okay, does this treatment have an effect? But they oftentimes don't have enough sample to say, all right, is the effect higher for one group than another? And I think our study was able to, I think, plausibly look at that. And so it is, I think, surprising to me that Democrats and Republicans didn't really differ in their responses to this messaging. And hopefully, I think future research can try to iron out why that's the case.
Could you say a little bit about how you pick the precise wording of the messages and whether you have a feel for whether it's the big picture content, that there is a scientific consensus indicating that humans are changing the climate, or specific words that may be triggering to people on different parts of the political spectrum? And how do you pick the messages so that you're reasonably confident that it's the big picture?
Yeah, that's a great question and a puzzle. So, I mean, what we did is we tried to keep the wording as similar as possible to the original studies. But obviously, the world has changed, so a lot of that language would be different. And we did give the researchers originally who did the studies an opportunity to revise and update their language. And I mean, maybe Jan can, kind of comment on this, but I find it kind of puzzling that one scientific consensus messaging did like very powerfully and others didn't. And then some moral reframing messages did a lot better than others. And so, at least what that tells me is that these kind of big, broad theories might not need to be revisited. But from a practical perspective, which is what Rayner cares about, kind of how these things are crafted specifically seems to matter a lot more than like the broader theories. So I think it's not just that, oh, well, scientific consensus is so powerful, any message will work. It's like specific kinds of messages. And again, I don't think our study nails the answer to that. But I think future research can kind of say, well, maybe there's more variables that we have to consider that the prior research hasn't taken into account.
Jan, can you spin this out a little further and speak to the influence of particular wordings versus the big picture components of the message?
Yeah, I think Neil described it exactly right, that what is puzzling is that like if we would like group like some messages by the theoretical rationale, like the results are not very consistent at all. And so like our study like wasn't really designed to identify like which version of of a certain category works best, but we do find strong evidence that like what specific wording you use, or like which like specific value you appeal to, seems to like matter quite a bit. I will say that like we offered like the developers of the original treatment, who are really the like ideas people from these treatments to like revise their treatments, and like a lot of them took advantage of that opportunity, which like suggests to me that, you know, like this could mean that like trying to adapt the language to the like current information environment might be quite relevant, because in our like early pilot testing where we used more of the original wording, we did not see like as many effects. So like it seems to be that the answer of how to draft persuasive messages has a lot of potential components that we like prior research like seems to explain in a way that like did not resonate with the results in our study.
Reiner, when I look at the results, one of the striking things is that the treatments had significant effects on aspects related to belief, but not as much effect on willingness to act, on contributions to environmental groups. And I wonder if you have thoughts on what it takes in order to really change people's behavior and not just their uh, level of agreement with a particular postulate.
That's a big question, and I think that in the case of the study, I think maybe just based on the Q&A, I should maybe say what the question was. So there was a question in the study that asked participants for the opportunity to distribute a portion of their payment to different institutions that work on environmental issues. And if John and Neil can correct me, but there was no effect of any of the treatments on improving the performance on that task. And so these kind of behavioral tasks we often include in these kinds of studies to sort of try to show a link of the treatments to actual behavior change. And I have to say I'm not exactly surprised by it. I don't think most of us would be. I think one of the things that the measure did is actually list real life organizations as the recipients of the donation, which is good, increases the ecological validity of the study. But one of the things I can tell you from talking to my marketing colleagues at EDF and other sister NGOs is that the brand awareness that these institutions carry are really important. So the identities of who is the recipient of the money you're giving and also who's been messaging you with the message that's trying to persuade you matter tremendously. And so in the case of why wouldn't anyone want any of the treatments produce an increased outcome, we can tell you sort of from our experience that the people who come and donate to us and entrust us with their philanthropy are focused on the solutions that we're championing and on the problems that were particular aspects of climate change that we're trying to tackle. And I think there's a lot of range of variability in that in the samples. So I think it's not surprising that you would see some of that get sort of muddled in the aggregation. But as the authors actually note in the paper, there would have probably been a number of other variables that would have been interesting to moderate the effects, so sort of make the effects of the different treatments contingent on other aspects of either the recipient of the message or of the particular climate issue that's being discussed. And a study as powerful as this, you know, it would have really modeled the results to include that. I think that's my intuition.
Before I follow up, let me just indicate to everyone in the audience that I'm going to turn it over to audience Q&A in about 5 minutes. And if you will type your question into the Q&A box that's either at the bottom or the top of your screen or hidden behind the More label, we'll get to as many questions as we can. And if you do want to target your question to one of the panelists in particular, please indicate that in the Q&A. And I'll read from the questions once we get to the audience Q&A part. Reiner, I wonder if just to follow up on your insights about the environmental NGOs, it seems like this transition from belief to active engagement is what the environmental NGOs really feel is critical. And as you say, the people who donate to EDF do it because they're convinced that your solutions are pushing the world in the right direction. And the fact that the study found that there was less impact on this genuine driving activism than on belief is kind of frustrating. And is that an indication, do you think, of the fact that it's just a bigger step to go from believing to actively engaged, or are there other issues that are involved?
Well, I think it's both. I think you need something. I think these frameworks of communication are incredibly helpful to shift people's perceptions, and that it's almost like at some point you've heard the message enough, if you've processed it enough and you've started thinking about it, you'll hit a certain level of belief that triggers action or a change sufficiently large in your way you view the world, kind of like an action potential in a neuron, right? Like you get to a certain level and the charge just triggers the behavior. And that's why these messages are important. Nonetheless, you need to have a sort of framework that pushes people in a certain direction. But I think it is a lot to ask one particular exposure to the message to trigger a large enough change in behavior, even when the behavior is very small, like donating a portion of your study payment to an organization. And I think part of it is also that when we do these kinds of surveys, we are, as the survey taker, an individual engaged in a conversation with an abstract entity that is basically a bunch of words on the computer screen. But in real life, we make decisions based on the influences of other people around us and people with whom we identify. And that also has a really important effect, being able to feel mobilized by other people around you. And so I think that's actually part of the value of sort of understanding some of these frameworks have really powerful messages because they carry with them that social flavor and activate some part of that motivation in people. But I think to really go into moving your body to doing something else needs to kick in, that it might be social.
Yeah. Jan, can I ask about the way you presented the results? I was especially interested in the approach of presenting the treatment effects as a proportion of the difference between Democrats and Republicans on most of the issues.
Yeah, so like that was actually an idea by Neil, which I thought was very smart in order to help people to like contextualize these effects, because like we use scales from 0 to 100, which can feel quite abstract, and so like contextualizing this as like like what is the percentage of the gap between like Democrats and Republicans, sort of like provides a nice benchmark for some of these effects. Could I also briefly follow up on the previous
Absolutely.
questions? Like I think like one thing that really stands out for me is that like the like model for these treatments, I think in the like research on pro-environmental communication has sort of been like these like trickle-down effects of like trying to like target attitudes and then hoping that is going to trickle down. I think we sort of like need to like potentially abandon that model and try to in our treatments really focus on the specific response that we want to move. So like if like we're trying to move behaviors, maybe the like treatment should like be very specific about like why like the response of increasing pro-environmental donations is important, and connect that to the like psychological idea of like highlighting scientific consensus, or like rather than like trying to connect climate change mitigation in an abstract way to a specific value, trying to like connect like pro-environmental donations like with that specific value. And even for the like trickle-down model, like I think we sometimes like think of these short treatments that we were able to test in an online experiment as like corresponding to like medical surgeries that are trying to like really fix an issue. And I like to think of it more as a session of physical therapy where we learn like a little bit about like how things work, and maybe we feel a little bit like better afterwards. But in order to really expect long-term effects, I think, you know, like we have to go to physical therapy again and again and again in order to see effects. And I would like assume that, and we need more research on that the same might be true about these messages. Like I think we need more work on a repeated exposure to these kinds of messages and see if that would potentially do better.
Yeah, let me follow up quickly. The last question from me before I go to the audience on and maybe this is a question for Neil. The idea that if you that there's some difference between stimulating action and just expressing agreement, but in a study like this, it's really hard to find the levers that really test whether or not people are motivated to act. And I guess willingness to donate to an environmental NGO is one metric. How do you think about really probing this question of whether people are motivated to act?
Yeah, so ideally you want to have outcomes that measure not just cheap talk, because everyone can say they care about the environment, everyone can say that they would vote a certain way. And so the closest we came in this study was to give people some money, small amount of money, but still some money to actually make it costly to express your preference. In other, work I've done, we've actually looked at other behavioral outcomes, like for example, do people substitute away from meat towards like vegetarian diets? And we actually have their restaurant orders in that study. So I think kind of more creative research. I will say that one of the most shocking things in our study is that not only is there a zero effect on the donation behavior, it's actually negatively correlated with some of the positive treatment effects. So what I mean by that is like the scientific consensus statement that actually increased all people's attitudes and willingness to believe in climate change and policies and voting and all of that stuff actually had a negative, not significant, but like a negative effect on the donation behavior. So why did that happen? So one speculation is that there's psychologists Dale Miller and Benoit Monin who came up with this idea of moral licensing, which is that when you say, oh, like I really care about the climate, sometimes people say, oh, I'm a good person because I said I cared about the climate, and that gives me license to do a bad thing, which is maybe to not donate or to actually eat more meat or to use more energy, use more water. So that's just speculative, but our results were consistent with this idea of moral licensing, where doing one thing that's good gives you license to do something else that's bad.
Interesting. Okay, let me turn to questions from the audience. First one is from Mark Grossman. Doesn't the source of the message matter, namely if it's coming from a partisan figure, influencer, academic, journalist, etc.? Rainer, you want to tackle that one?
Sure, I'm sure this is not controversial in any way or form, but it does matter. I think people tend to respond better to in-group messengers, so people with whom they share the social identity. We've done quite a bit of work on that at EF and find it to be really important. And since we're a nonpartisan organization, that sometimes means that we are putting out messages that somebody else has put out that may not be seen as a direct ally, but who is effective messenger for a different group than the one you might belong to. And I think also that I can tell you for a fact that the brand specialist at EDF would tell you a lot of the effect on the donations has to do with the fact that people don't really know that much about environmental organizations, but that they do evaluate them at some level on the basis of what they do and how they do it. and I can tell you for some projects I've collaborated with them, we have found that, for example, people will express very little awareness of most groups, and they will express more awareness of groups that we made up for the survey than real groups, right? Because the names just sound familiar, but they still don't donate to any, even those fictional groups that they think they're familiar with.
Yeah, let's stick with this theme of what kind of treatments indicate a willingness to act. Here's a question from Catherine Royster, who writes, why was donation to an environmental organization and not, for example, voting intention or consumer behavior chosen a way to gauge intention to act? Jan, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so great question. So we actually had more measures, and I think like this highlights an important distinction. So like we had more measures that captured intentions to act. Like we had a measure of support for pro-environmental candidates and like hypothetical elections between a pro-environmental candidate, but who like disagreed with the participant on another important issue, such as their stance on abortion. We also had behavioral intentions measures where people said, like to what extent they would like to donate to an organization, but it was a hypothetical. And we do find effects on those outcomes where it is hypothetical, but in the one outcome where it was actually incentivized so that their decision had a direct, tangible outcome, which is that money was donated to organizations. Like we saw these like very different effects, and the reason that we chose those was that it was like we were able to do that in the context of an online experiment.
Question on durability from our Stanford colleague John Krosnick, and one of the leaders in this space. Can you comment on how strong the effects of the message were and how long the effects lasted? Jan, do you have any sense of the durability of the effects?
So like we did not do a durability test here. So like the effect size was between like 1 and 4 points on a scale from 0 to 100. In prior studies that we have done, we typically find that after 2 weeks, the effect has shrunken to like 30 to 40% of the original effect size. So like you can interpret that as like a lot of the effect goes away pretty quickly. You can also interpret it as like there is evidence that some of the effect still stays around after like a single exposure for at least 2 weeks, and in another study that we have done it like after 1 month.
Here's one that's more on the cast of characters from Jared Tolbert. Aside from yourselves and Jonathan Haidt, are there other figures in this space of messaging who we should all be aware of? Reiner? Yeah.
Well, there's quite a few people, probably too many to mention, but I think based on this paper, I think, for example, Matthew Feinberg, did one of the initial purity frameworks. I think he's continued to do some work. It's a colleague of Jan and Neil. I think John Schuld and Adam Pearson, who I've worked with, do a lot of work on different kinds of messaging strategies. I think also the Yale program on climate change communications often publishes some of their work freely for people to see. But there's just a lot of people working on this from many different perspectives. Caitlin Ramey at the University of Michigan, and Kim Balsky at the University of Chicago, for example. They work on very specific, sometimes aspects of climate change and very specific solutions. And I think that's important to also look at.
And the paper has a glittering list of authors who include many of the people who have been leaders in this field over decades. Here's a question from Chris Chidsey. Can the speakers comment on the following hypothesis? Belief is seen as a personal choice that requires less risk, but the utility of actions require collective action that the respondent is skeptical of being realized and therefore seen as risky. So that, well, I'm willing to take action, but I don't think my neighbors are, and therefore I'm going to be more skeptical. Neil, any way we could parse that kind of concern?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that can explain all the results because we have some questions that rely on collective action that are intentional. So, for example, we have a question like, oh, like, would you reduce your water use or something like that? So, as we know, that's like collective action problem. Like, you can reduce your water use all you want, but if no one else is doing it, it's not going to have any impact on climate change, right? So we asked about that personal stuff. And the same thing with donation. Donation is a collective action problem too. And the fact that you get like opposite results with the behavioral intentions and the donations, even though what's held constant is that they're both collective action problems, I think suggests to me that like that's not kind of some big omitted variable that's explaining the results or anything.
Jan, do you want to comment on that one? The question of collective versus individual action.
Yeah, I think that it is a really interesting idea. Like I do think that one promising approach, I think, for inducing attitude or behavior changes oftentimes like communicating social norms. And I know of one study in particular that has, or like several studies that have tested like norm interventions, like telling people like most other people like take action, like in a very famous study, like that they reuse their towels as a hotel gas, and that has like led to like more people reusing their own towels. Like I think like communicating information about like what other people are doing is an important consideration here. Like there will be like another great treatment for us to include. But as Neil said, I don't think that it can like necessarily explain some of the findings we have seen in our study here. But I do think it is a great hypothesis.
Here's a question about the big picture implications. This one's from Jana Zadek. Given that there's been seemingly no shortage of messaging concerning climate change and the small effect of the current study, do you have thoughts about whether messaging is in fact an important variable at this time concerning addressing climate change? Maybe each of you would like to think about that one. And Neil, you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think that there's a lot of, if you look at the broader literature on political messaging and reframing, one of my takeaways from it is that I think kind of messaging and framing is like very overrated, and like actual policies are kind of underrated. Like for example, like carbon tax is just not popular. And I just think if you're gonna like reframe it like seven different ways, that's not gonna like fundamentally do the thing that this is a first best solution that's just not politically feasible. So you have to focus on what are the second best solutions. And I think the Biden administration understood this, which is why, Inflation Reduction Act, it's basically just like, let's just get popular policies that are climate related out there and don't focus on like unpopular policies that you just message better. Now, I think the jury's still out on the Inflation Reduction Act, like whether that did provide political returns and how popular it is and the durability and everything. But I guess like one of my takeaways is like in some of the research I'm seeing that's not about climate, people just are very responsive to popular policies rather than reframing unpopular policies.
And is the implication that we don't really need to worry as much about the messaging as about getting the policy right?
I'm just putting that out there as like a possibility. So
Okay.
obviously, like Inflation Reduction Act is not a first best policy. It's highly inefficient. It's very expensive. things like carbon taxes or tradable permit systems are way better. But the government has tried to pass all that stuff for a generation without any success, and they were able to pass the IRA because it was popular, not because they were able to message it in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, Reiner, maybe you could comment a little bit about this interface between what makes people believe in something and what makes something popular, and how are they related to each other?
Well, I mean, I think pretty much agree 100% with what Neil said, that it's sometimes, and what the person posed the question that we ask ourselves all the time, which is, do we really need to continue messaging people about climate change to get climate action? It's perhaps more important to get people to pay attention to the climate impacts that are happening around us and what we're trying to do to alleviate them or eliminate those. And that means the policies and the solutions that people are crafting. And sometimes people don't know enough about them to have an opinion or stand by them. And for some of them, they do. And so, and sometimes we know, as Neil just said, the example of taxes, very difficult to get a large chunk of Americans to support taxes, right? But that also means that we need to, which is why I believe in social science, that a basic level has to address some of these issues, is that we can help economists and others design policies that are going to be more uptakeable early on. Like if somebody had been in the room with the carbon tax designers, they might have said, it's a bad idea to call it a carbon tax. Let's make it a different kind of mechanism altogether. And it's a different policy. It's not a reframing. It's just you can do another carbon pricing mechanism, and that might have been more popular. And so I do think that policy in the end is what's really important. We've been doing some work looking at people discussing local level climate policy across the political aisle. And people are very willing to engage and discuss the features of it they like and they don't like and how they want to fix it. And it's in part because when you are talking of something that is very relevant, it's very local, it takes on a different meaning that's different than just an abstract problem that's being discussed in a very scientific language far away from you.
Yeah, so there's several questions in here about whether particular messages are relevant to particular kinds of climate-related outcomes. And one question I was curious about is posted by an anonymous attendee, but it says, could you elaborate on the environmental purity results, maintaining the purity of the natural environment? Jan, how should we think about that one?
In terms of like what the treatment
What does that mean? Is the idea that we're by confronting climate change or are preserving God's creation? Does it mean that we're eliminating pollutants? How do you think the purity argument lands?
Yeah, like I think like the things that you just mentioned are exactly the two central components of the message that we tested. Like try to preserve like the earth in its like natural pure state as much as possible. I'm trying to like disable pollutions of our own bodies. Like that is like very much the argument. And like as Neil as mentioned, it's trying to connect like climate change mitigation with like a value that prior research has shown is held especially among American conservatives. And like we were surprised to find that it actually like resonates quite well with the liberal participants in our study too.
Yeah, so just to build on that, like, okay, so what did Haidt do like 20 years ago? So his argument was that part of the reason people think something is immoral is because they think it's disgusting, right? So he would ask questions like, is it moral to eat your dog if your dog is already dead? right? Or is it moral to have sex with your sister if you're using protection? Like he would have these strange questions. And he had this strong claim that conservatives were like more likely than liberals to view these things as unethical or immoral, right? Things that were disgusting. And that's kind of where all these treatments for purity came up with, that the way you convince conservatives is by telling them that pollution is disgusting and dirty and things like that. I would say that since all that stuff came out, there's been a lot of skepticism that conservatives are care more about purity. So the COVID-19 pandemic is like a good example of that, where if anything, like conservatives were more okay with germs and dirtiness. So I think our results, I think kind of are with this big thing that we should question this idea that purity is like a uniquely conservative thing, that maybe like it's more broad across the population than we originally thought.
And if I may add something, we see
Sure.
exactly that with different kinds of climate solutions. There are some climate solutions where liberals have extremely strong, disgust-sensitive kind of responses to the solution, while conservatives are fine with it. And in others, it flips back to sort of the theoretical one. So it's important to keep that in mind. Yes, some of these effects, as you guys point out in the paper, were tailor-made, quote unquote, for conservative Americans, but they work for everybody.
The ick factor in climate messaging. Here's a question from Anna Koster. I'd love to see another study that's the same, but at the end there's no survey of intended actions, only an actual donation. I wonder if the moral licensing of the stated intentions affects the donation. Jan, what about studies of actual actions rather than intended actions?
Yeah, like I think that is a really smart idea. Like we could have like potentially like randomized this too, so that like you could still collect the attitudes, but they come after the behavior. Yeah, so I think that is a really smart suggestion to like overcome this issue uh, uh, of like not offering participants the opportunity to like claim their like morality by first answering attitude questions and then answering the behavioral question. Yeah, like unfortunately we didn't like we had our first block of attitude questions that always came first. So like our study can't really attest that, but yeah, like I think that it is a very smart idea.
There's another question in here about funding from Debbie Meitels, who funded the study. It seems that the results of such a multi-institutional study could be easily biased by the institution that funded it. Jan or Neil?
I mean, we were funded by like the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and the Stanford
Which is
Center
clearly unbiased.
on Philanthropy and Civil Society. I mean, like I can like state clearly that there was no involvement by the funders in the design of the study or in the data analysis. As Neil pointed out, we pre-registered and even like got the like approval by the journal to like publish the findings like independent on what the specific findings would be. We were like testing these like messages in the context of us being skeptical based on our pilot results. So you know, like I mean, I'm the first author of the study, so like of course, like I may believe like more in our like unbiasedness, but I think like we've like, taken several steps in order to like you know like try to be as transparent as possible in our design and our reporting.
I would also say I totally agree with the question asker skepticism. You should always be skeptical. Never trust someone that they're unbiased because they tell you they're unbiased. Why should you trust us? We have a date stamped pre registration document that occurred before the data was collected that you can download. we made all the code and data available for everyone to analyze on their own. You can download the data, you can download the code, you can compare it to the original date stamped document for how the data was to be analyzed and make your own judgment. Don't trust us that is unbiased. Trust the institutions that are in place.
Great. Thanks so much. We just have a couple of minutes left, and let me turn to each of you for a closing thought on maybe one sentence on what you learned from this study and another sentence on how it will change the work you do moving forward. Reiner, you want to start?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I thought it was a great study, and it would be really interesting to tackle with a similar methodology one of these questions that many of us ponder, which is how do these different kind of messages and message frames interact with each other in the wild in terms of the sequence when they're used to talk about the same solution or problem. It's something a lot of people spend a lot of their time worrying about, and if some academic researchers could take the time to work on it, would be really valuable to our field.
Thanks. Neil, take home message.
I would just say that all this stuff is very complicated, and I don't think there's a silver bullet. So I think kind of future research is not about searching for the silver bullet message, but rather dealing with all the stuff that Rainer was talking about.
Great, thanks. And Jan.
Yeah, what I really enjoyed here was trying to bring people from like very different theoretical traditions together and like try to test their ideas in sort of a tournament style in a way that people have to sign off on their treatments and the experimental design beforehand. And I think that like while here we did not find a clear winner, I do think that this style of research holds like a lot of promise to provide helpful insights for the future, because it's also like you can like make different kinds of statement when you talk about the effects of 10 different treatments in the literature rather than just a single one. So I do hope that we see more of these style of studies for the climate change communication literature as well as more broadly.
Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks you, Jan and Neil, for a really, really interesting study, and also for the emphasis on the integrity building through the pre-registration approach. This is the first webinar we've done jointly with the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. Thanks to Patrick Berry and the rest of the community there. Thanks to the Stanford Policy and Engagement team with Lee Rosenbaum and Serena Pertel. And thanks to Justin Warren for support with the videos. Thanks to everyone for wonderful questions and for really helping us advance scholarship on a key enabler of action on climate change. Farewell, everyone.